Good morning, everyone. It's Katie. It's September the 5th, a pretty nice day, but windy. And I hope that you have thought a little bit about what we talked about last night and are beginning to take a look at the required readings and media links that I've provided you. Right now, I'm recording the presentation, Ontology, Epistemology, and Methodology, and this can serve as a review for those of you who have encountered these ideas before, or it can be new information for those of you who are just joining us in women's and gender studies. Either way, it'll stay in the module for you to take a look at if you just want to refresh yourself. So here we go. Feminism is an engaged human rights position seeking to expose and remedy gender inequities. And so that is the critical component of action. The study of gender is a starting point, but we also have to consider other aspects of human existence, including race, age, class, physical and mental ability, geolocations, sexuality, and social status. Not only are we gendered, but we also occupy these social positionalities. And these are the kinds of locations that I am asking you to think about when you develop your positionality statement. Feminist research recognizes that we must approach gender in ways that recognize all these intersecting and interacting locations. In other words, we need to understand multiple ways that privilege and oppressions operate at the same time. The intersectional commitments of feminist research methods constitute a feminist research ethics, including concerns about ontology, i.e. the nature of knowledge itself, the epistemological, what counts as knowledge and who gets to produce it, methodology, i.e. the theories of research, and methods, which is the way you do the research, such as data collection. Feminist research challenges received knowledge. In 1987, Sandra Harding asked, "Is there a distinctive method of inquiry for feminists?" And Harding distinguished, that didn't work. Harding distinguished between epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, methodology, a theory and analysis of how research should or does proceed, and method, a technique for gathering evidence. And we often see methodology and methods conflated when we talk about them. I'm not particularly picky about that myself, but there is a difference between methodology and method. So a question for you, what is reality? So hopefully you can identify this very famous painting by Renoir and a photo of the same lily pond. Which of these is real in your mind? No matter what you answered in the previous slide, what you see as depicting reality is part of your epistemology and positionality. So even though someone would say that the photo of the lily pad is really the realistic image, you need to realize that decisions were made about it as well. So what was left out, for example, of that photograph? What was seen as being the central piece of it? What did the photographer focus on? How were the colors and the lighting adjusted in that? So it's not particularly an objective picture of that lily pond. It's a curated, I guess we could call it, curated picture of that lily pond. So now I'm going to ask you to pause and take a look at this video on positionality, epistemology, insider-outsider status, and other related issues. There is the URL for you to copy and paste into your own browser, We're not going to watch it together now. It's too long to do that. But think about some of these issues. In narrative inquiry, are you an insider or outsider when you're pursuing your particular research puzzle? And what would be the implications for each of those statuses? Science has often functioned in the disservice of marginalized groups. Think of one example that proves this statement. For example, drugs for heart trouble is often trial led only on males, because women's hormones are so different and complex. This need results in poor outcomes for women with cardiac issues. Remember also the Canadian experiments with nutrition on Inuit communities in the Arctic in the early 20th century. Many starved during those experiments. So what is the epistemological crisis? In challenging conventional epistemologies and their methodologies, both of which justified problematic understandings of research methods, feminists have contributed to the epistemological crisis of the modern West. Crisis? What crisis? So ask yourselves, for whom is this a crisis? Who is affected by this crisis? What impact does this crisis have on traditional research? What are feminists' concerns, and what are their solutions? You can't discuss it with a partner if you're doing this by yourself, but take a few minutes and think about these questions. So the challenge here is what an epistemological crisis is and when it occurred in the research milieu. Hint, it occurred not too long ago, and this is still a conflict among researchers. And it happens particularly among researchers on the qualitative side of things versus the quantitative side of things. So what is epistemology? And what is epistemic authority versus epistemic privilege? So epistemic authority, who gets to know, who determines what knowledge is and who gets to determine that? That's epistemic authority, and it's conferred, or has been conferred in the past, on mostly Western researchers, mostly white Western researchers, and until not so long ago, almost exclusively on white male Western researchers. Epistemic privilege means being in the groups who have the opportunity, to become authority, and therefore can become privileged to speak further. So in my discipline, which is learning design, most of the scholars of learning design emerged in the early 20th century, and they included people like Skinner and Thorndike, who were in the first place privileged to be scholars because they were in a class that was able to go to university. They were able to enroll in degrees and programs that were male-dominated. So they were mostly middle-class males who received this, who had this epistemic privilege. And they were the voice of learning design or instructional design for, 60, 70 years, probably. So they brought a particular view of the world, a particular epistemology to the work that they were doing. And so those were the kinds of experiments they set up, the kinds of interpretations that they made. And that became the grand narrative of instructional design. Until people like me and people from different cultures, for example, began to ask some questions. about the very idea of an optimal blueprint for learning. Well, optimal for who? A blueprint for who? And who get to develop that particular blueprint? And then in this particular conflict, we need to look at power differences. So there are three contexts or more in which power differences arise. The first being the researcher and the researched, usually bringing different amounts and kinds of social power, the social locations we talked about earlier, to the research situation. The research process themselves, producing power differences in terms of who defines the research project, who gets to set that research agenda, who gets to do the recruitment, whether or not the recruited have full rights of refusal to be involved, and the theories and methods that go along with that, and who gets to write the research report, who gets to tell the story, which becomes the narrative or the truth, which I put in quotation marks. Feminists must be critically reflective of and research these power differences in social situations and institutions, but also in their own research. And this is where reflexivity comes in. We'll talk about that. For example, community-based participatory research, or CBPR, action research, and activist research are examples of methodologies that try to even out power differences. So, I'll tell you a story of a research project I was involved in. It was Indigenous-led, partly Indigenous-led. We collaborated with Indigenous scholars and communities, and the title of that project was "We Are All Connected." And what we did is we had scholars from, I think, 5 different faculties. We had elders. We had Indigenous scholars from Native Studies, but also in the other faculties, and we had graduate students. And we took a look at how Indigenous ways of knowing were implicated in the curricula in the AILS faculty, Faculty of Education, Faculty Saint-Jean, and Faculty of Extension. And I'm missing one. I can't remember what it was now. So the way that we developed this particular study was in dialogue through a sharing circle that was led by an elder, in which we all shared what we thought was important to ask and to know. And there we had an advisory group, equally of university scholars, some of whom were Indigenous and members of the Indigenous community. The research was vetted by this particular group, and at many, many points we came back together in a sharing circles and shared what we were learning. Everything that came out of that research was negotiated ahead of time in terms of ownership, who could share, what they could share, when they could share. And the research was approved by a committee. It probably isn't called a committee, sorry, in the particular Indigenous communities that we were working in. So we challenge Western notions of who has the power in the research and who is the researched. So we were all researchers and we were all researched, and we tried as much as possible to share power. Now, of course, realistically, power differences were not leveled. They couldn't be. The university, for one thing, had the money, had the funding for this particular research. There was a power difference right there. So those are the kinds of things in feminist narrative inquiry that we talk about and we try to address. We call them sometimes fieldwork dilemmas. So let's talk for just a bit about theories of knowledge. So Wigington and others, I'm not sure if you've got that paper, but I'll take a look and see, have identified sort of three theories of knowledge that are epistemological stances and also reflect in some ways the evolution of feminist thought. So the first is feminist empiricism, the second is standpoint theory, and the third was turn to language. And note we're not using the language of waves here, the first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, and so on. We're talking about theories of knowledge that have epistemological stances built into them. So methodology is how research is done. And as we saw earlier, epistemology suggests methodology, and certain methods and tools are associated with each. Here's my attempt at a visual for that. So you come with a certain epistemology, and there are various methodologies that sort of fit into that sort of worldview of knowledge, how it's produced, who gets to produce it, and so on. And then there are methods and tools that are usually aligned or part of that methodological stance. And note that they're not necessarily only used in that particular methodology. Interviews, for example, as methods, are used in many different kinds of methodologies. So feminist empiricism, how about that? It's research that collects data about girls', women's, or gendered life experiences based on testimony about gender-based oppression. So feminist empiricists have contributed to research in medicine, law, health studies, politics, international relations, economics, digital, media, and many others. Basically, feminist empiricism inserts that with the inclusion of women in all phases of the research, including theory development, gender bias can be eradicated and objective knowledge achieved. So one of the questions or one of the criticisms of feminist empiricism has been this idea that there is such a thing as objective knowledge. And that's associated, of course, with positivism. And that this was Lord who said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So by using the same kinds of theories and methods that are used in these sorts of grand narratives of what is real research, what is objective knowledge, you're never going to be able to disrupt that kind of thinking. You're never going to be able to make a case for a different way of viewing the world. If you're using these tools, you're never going to break the mold of researcher as sole authority and this God's eye view of knowing. Some of the theorists that are associated with feminist empiricism include Sue Rosser, who's quite well known in family and preventative medicine. And she asked, why are women in science still so controversial? Now, she asked that several decades ago, but the question remains. Why are women in science still controversial? Why do they have trouble getting published and promoted? And there's been a lot of research done by Sue Rosser and colleagues on this question. For example, submitting papers for peer review, some papers with the names of female authors and some people with the names of male authors. Same paper, different names on. Male authors receiving better reviews and having a higher acceptance rate, for example, for publishing. The chilly climate or the glass ceiling that women academic scientists very often encounter for many reasons. There are not as many of them in the pipeline. They don't get the mentorship, the academic mentorship that their male colleagues do. Their progression may be interrupted by childbearing, for example. Their ability, for instance, to work 80 hours a week certainly may be disrupted by domestic responsibilities, which women still bear more than men. And we saw that very clearly during COVID. Submissions by women fell off drastically, which affected promotion rates and so on. Gillian Rose is another one of these scholars who asks, what is legitimate geographical knowledge and who gets to produce it? So she sort of busted out, I guess, of this sort of narrow view of geography and talked about geographies of the body, did some space and place-based studies in human geography and developed theoretical frameworks in that area. And Linda Burke, who has done a lot of ethnographic research on human-animal relationships. And if you have a chance, Dr. Chloe Taylor in our department is someone who does a lot of research in this area. And ecofeminism is related to some of this work. Second, epistemological stance is standpoint theory. And standpoint theory argues that knowledge stems from one's social position, rejects the idea of objective knowledge, and is transparent about the perspectives from which researchers view the world. So standpoint is embodied in specific actors who are located in less privileged positions with the social order, and so are engaged in activities quite different from those who have a privileged location. Both feminist empiricism and standpoint feminism played a major role in moving from positivist notions, mostly based on white, Western, androcentric views of knowledge production, to a more multiple and post-positivist view of research. Zelinda Tuhiwai Smith, an Indigenous scholar, in 1996 said, "The critique of positivism by feminist theorists, ethnic minorities, and Indigenous peoples has emerged from the experiences of people who have been studied, researched, written about, and defined by social scientists." And you can see in this the slogan, I don't want to belittle it by calling it a slogan, of many Indigenous peoples who say nothing about us without us. And this is also a criticism of sort of, I forget the term, standby shooting? Standby research? No, stand something research, where the researchers sort of fly in, for example, to a community, extract knowledge or information out of the community, like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube, and then go back and put it on their toothbrush and brush it into a peer-reviewed paper. So standpoint theory was very, very critical of that. And we can see in standpoint theory sort of, the roots of intersectionality beginning to emerge. So you can see that there were three different approaches to feminist standpoint theory, embodied in social location and experience, constructed in community, and as a site through which to begin inquiry. Now, of course, there are lots of critiques of feminist standpoint theory. It's been, sometimes it's criticized as essentialist. People have said it's erroneous to argue equality will necessarily follow from a female point of view. It's a dualistic binary approach is one critique. Frankly, I don't see that myself, but that is one critique. And it is certainly dominated, or has been, by white Western middle-class women. And that is a very strong critique of feminist theory overall, right? That it has been dominated by white Western middle-class feminists. Here are some theorists associated with standpoint theory. Cynthia Dillard, and she talked about Endarkin feminist epistemology and did a lot of work in Africa. Sandra Harding, who's probably best associated with standpoint theory, and she is a scientist. So she did a lot of work in the feminist critique of science. Trinh Minh Ha, a Vietnamese researcher and in film. And Dorothy Smith, who's a Canadian, does institutional ethnography. And she asked some of the key questions earlier on about what ethnography would look like if it was done by women, if it was done by members of marginalized communities, if it was done by the members of the communities being studied, for example. So she kind of turned that sociology upside down a little bit. And finally, at least according to Wigington, the turn to language. And this is certainly, I guess, an era that we've been in for a little while. And that involves the social construction of gender and postmodernism. And if you describe yourself as a postmodern or a post-structural feminist researcher, what you're really concerned with is looking at language and discourse and how power is contained and revealed there. So these are known or can be known as the difference feminisms. So these feminisms focus on the social construction of gender and a more unstable and flexible notion of knowledge and identity. So if you are a post-structural feminist, for example, you will argue that there is no truth that exists outside of social context, that gender itself is socially constructed and has no beginning, no middle, and no end. So these posts bring together a multiplicity of perspectives and lived experiences and are concerned with the intersecting threads of oppression and power that make up feminist research. Rosemarie Tong, who, by the way, writes a book and a new edition emerges every once in a while about feminisms, so each chapter is a different feminism, puts it like this. The essence is pursuing a truth that can be whatever power proclaims it to be. Science is no more objective than politics or ethics, both of which are subjective, contextual, historically contingent, and almost always deployed to serve self-interest. A seminal moment and exemplar of this turn is reflected in the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977 that articulated the multiple and interlocking oppressions of Black lesbian feminists around race, sexuality, and gender. Basically, intersectionality well, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it didn't exactly emerge from the Combahee River Collective Statement. It really was a thought and a theory. Wasn't quite a theory maybe, but was certainly a thought much earlier than that. But again, these epistemologies, is more than there's several here. You're looking at power relationships. There's some standpointedness in here because you're trying to look from an oppressed point of view, for example, and take into account what people's social oppressions are. And you realize that gender itself is constructed. You're not born with it, although, our politics currently would suggest that you are, and it's immutable. But the postmodernists and post-structuralists say, no, definitely it's mutable. And if you are interested in pursuing this, I suggest you read Judith Butler, who talks about gender as a performance. So she talks about gender performativity. So if you think about these epistemologies, and these are just three of them. see if you can place yourself in one of them. What do you believe about knowledge? What is knowledge? Again, who gets to study knowledge? Who gets to create knowledge? Who gets to communicate what is knowledge and what isn't? So, again, post-structuralism, the category woman itself is troubling, and it should be kept unstable and undefined. The subjectification and discursive regimes through which we become gendered subjects need to be confronted. And if in post-structuralism research, one of its intended outcomes is agency and possibilities for action. But there are critiques. So one of them is that feminist post-structural scholars are more concerned with language and discourse than with action. There's a lot of jargon and inaccessibility. I heartily agree. As a post-structuralist, I would call myself a post-structuralist. I find lots of people really difficult to read. There's too much focus on fluidity. I don't know, you can decide for yourself if that's true. And lately we've heard of a lot of criticism about wokeness and identity politics. Again, my attempt to develop a graphic for you. So these are some of the frameworks that we're talking about when we're talking about the turn to language. I invite you to pursue them. Here's some theorists that we see associated with the turn to language. Jacques Derrida, who is a French scholar and philosopher. Juliet Kristeva, also French, and a philosopher. Judith Butler, who I've just mentioned. Gayatri Chakrabarty. She asked this very famous question: can the subaltern speak? Can the oppressed speak? And how? Where are their voices? Eve Kozovsky, who is a pioneer of queer theory, and if you're taking a course with Dr. Simone Pfleger, you will certainly be reading her. And very famous Donna Haraway, who took a look at links between technology, social codes, and so on, and came up with cyborg theory, which again is not easy to read, but it's really sort of a fascinating look at feminism and sort of this intersection of feminism and technology, and is also a critic of AI. So I'm suggesting for your own edification that you make yourself a table comparing feminist empiricism, standpoint theory, and the posts on these dimensions: knowledge claims, sources of oppression, feminist responses, methodologies, and foundational scholars, and perhaps critiques if you want to add that. It's not an assignment or anything. It just might be sort of a useful intellectual exercise for you.